Leo adjusted the brim of his worn straw hat, the midday sun casting long shadows across his small, meticulously cared-for garden. This patch of earth was his sanctuary, a riot of wildflowers and native grasses that buzzed with the gentle industry of bees. It was a stark contrast to the rest of Oakwood Estates, a neighborhood of pristine, chemically green lawns and rigidly pruned hedges. His garden was an island of beautiful chaos in an ocean of sterile order. From the corner of his eye, he saw the sleek, silver sedan whisper past his house. It slowed just enough for him to see the driver, his ex-wife Claire, her lips curled into a familiar sneer of disapproval. She did not wave. She never did. Her disapproval was a constant, oppressive humidity in the air he breathed. Claire lived 2 houses down in the sprawling modern mansion they had built together. Now it was her kingdom, and he was just a peasant tending his humble plot just outside the castle walls. The divorce had been a quiet, brutal affair. She had called him unambitious, boring, a man content to live in the shadows while she was meant for the sun. He had not fought her. He had let her take the house, the cars, the accounts she knew about, wanting only peace, and the small gatehouse at the entrance of the neighborhood that had once belonged to his grandfather. She had laughed, calling it a shack, a fitting home for a man with no vision. He had simply signed the papers. A few minutes after her car disappeared around the bend, he heard the distinctive click of the mailbox opening. He sighed, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of a dirt-caked glove. He knew what it would be. Inside the cool metal box was a single, crisp envelope, the logo of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association printed in an elegant, severe font in the top left corner. Claire was the president of the HOA, of course she was. She had seized power within months of the divorce, her charisma and sharp-edged charm easily winning over neighbors who valued appearances above all else. He sat on his simple wooden porch swing, the chain creaking like an old church door, and opened the letter. The words were cold, bureaucratic, but the malice behind them was entirely personal. Violation notice, unkempt, and overgrown landscaping, bylaw 7.4. It cited his wildflower garden as a blight on the community's cohesive aesthetic and a potential haven for vermin. He was instructed to replace the native flora with approved turf grass and boxwood shrubs within 14 days, or face a fine of $100 per day. Leo stared at the words, a familiar weariness settling deep in his bones. It was not about the garden. It was about him. It was a public shaming, a formal declaration that he did not belong. He folded the letter and placed it on the small table beside him. Next to it lay another envelope, one that had arrived a week ago. It was thick, heavy, made of expensive cream-colored paper, bearing the name of a prestigious downtown law firm, Harrison and Sterling. He had assumed it was some final, forgotten piece of divorce administration, a loose end Claire needed tied. The thought of dealing with anything related to her had been so draining that he had simply left it there, unopened. Now, looking at the 2 letters, side by side, the flimsy, insulting notice from the HOA and the weighty, serious one from the lawyers, he felt a strange premonition. He let out a long, slow breath and picked up the heavier envelope. The paper felt substantial in his hands, a world away from the cheap paper of the violation notice. He slit it open with his thumb. Inside was not a demand or a legal threat, but a politely worded request. It was from a Mr. Jonathan Harrison, a senior partner who identified himself as the long-time legal counsel for Leo's late grandfather, Arthur Jennings. The letter requested a meeting at Leo's earliest convenience to discuss the administration and future direction of your holdings, specifically pertaining to the entity known as Evergreen Properties, LLC. Leo frowned. He remembered his grandfather talking about his projects, but the old man had been intensely private about his business affairs. After his passing, the will had seemed straightforward, a sizable but not extravagant trust fund for Leo, and the small gatehouse free and clear. He had never heard of Evergreen Properties. He read the letter again, the formal language a puzzle he could not quite solve. A seed of curiosity, long dormant, began to stir within him. For 2 years he had accepted his lot. He had endured the pitying glances of his former friends and the open contempt of his ex-wife. He had sought nothing but the quiet solace of his garden and the simple rhythm of his days. But this letter, coupled with the petty tyranny of the HOA violation, felt like a shift in the tectonic plates of his life. He looked out at his garden, at the vibrant purples of the coneflowers and the delicate dance of the bluebells. It was his. It was a reflection of him, quiet, resilient, and refusing to conform to someone else's sterile ideal. And Claire wanted to destroy it. She wanted to pave it over, to make it just like everything else, to erase the last vestige of his identity from her perfect, manicured world. A cold resolve began to form in his heart. He would not let her. The marriage had been a slow erosion of his spirit. Claire had been dazzling at first, a whirlwind of energy and ambition. He, a quiet man who managed the private investment firm his grandfather had founded, was fascinated by her fire. He had mistaken her relentless social climbing for passion, her materialism for a desire for a beautiful life. He provided the foundation, the steady, unseen wealth that funded her lifestyle. His work was complex, requiring patience and a deep understanding of market subtleties. He managed legacy accounts and trusts, growing wealth not with flashy, high-risk ventures, but with careful, long-term strategy. To Claire, it was dreadfully boring. "You just sit in that dusty office all day, moving numbers around," she would say, her voice dripping with a casual condescension. "Mark, now he's a real estate developer. He builds things. People see what he does." Mark was her new partner, a man with a dazzling smile, a flashy watch, and a portfolio of half-finished condominium projects. He had appeared in their lives, and soon Claire was echoing his talk of synergy and disruption. She began to see Leo not as her partner, but as an obstacle. His quiet contentment was an anchor holding her back from the glittering life she felt she deserved. The divorce proceedings were a masterclass in her cruelty. She painted him as a passionless drone, a man who had emotionally abandoned her years ago. Her lawyer, a shark in a tailored suit, argued that her emotional labor in building their social standing entitled her to the lion's share of the assets. Leo, exhausted and heartbroken, had simply agreed. He gave her the house, the art collection, the portfolio of stocks he had set up for their retirement. All he asked for was the gatehouse and enough to live on without worry. She had believed she was taking everything of value, never understanding that the real source of their wealth, the family firm he ran, was structured as a trust in his name alone, untouchable by her. She had seen the steady income it provided, but had never bothered to understand the capital behind it. Now, as the de facto ruler of Oakwood Estates, her power was almost absolute. The HOA board was stacked with her allies, people who were either charmed by her or intimidated by her. Meetings were less about community governance and more about Claire holding court. She and Mark, whom she had installed as vice president, would sit at the head of the long table in the community clubhouse, a pair of suburban monarchs. "The issue of property values is paramount," she had declared at the last meeting, her voice resonating with false gravity. We must maintain a standard of excellence. Certain properties," she had paused, her eyes flicking towards the general direction of Leo's home, "are beginning to drag down our collective investment with their idiosyncratic landscaping choices." Mark had chimed in, his tone smooth and supportive. "Claire is absolutely right. A uniform aesthetic sends a message of stability and affluence. It's about protecting our brand." No one had dared to object. They were all caught in her web, afraid of being the next target of her disapproval. The violation notices started arriving at Leo's door a week later. The first was for the garden. The second, a week after that, was for the colour of his mailbox. It was a tasteful forest green, but the HOA had just passed a new rule, championed by Claire, that all mailboxes must be black. A third notice arrived a few days later. His 10-year-old sedan, always kept in perfect running condition, was cited for being a vehicle of an age inconsistent with the community's standards. The notice suggested he park it in his garage, out of sight. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, a campaign of petty harassment designed to make him feel so unwelcome that he would simply leave. Each new envelope in his mailbox felt like a stone being thrown at his window. He had absorbed the blows, his patience a deep well. But the garden was different. It was a living thing, a piece of his grandfather's legacy. The old man had been an avid naturalist and had cultivated the original patch of wildflowers on this very spot. Leo had only expanded and tended to it. To destroy it would be to dishonor that memory. It was the final straw. That evening, Leo sat in his quiet living room and dialed the number on the letter from Harrison and Sterling. He made an appointment for the following afternoon. As he hung up the phone, he felt a sense of purpose he had not felt in years. The sleeping giant inside him was beginning to stir. Claire, meanwhile, was feeling emboldened. Her campaign against Leo was working perfectly. She saw his quietness not as patience, but as weakness. She believed he was crumbling, just as he had during the divorce. "He'll be gone by Christmas," she boasted to Mark as they sat on the patio of her magnificent house, sipping expensive wine. "We just need to apply a little more pressure. I have an idea that will solve our Leo problem for good." Her eyes gleamed with a predatory light. She was drafting a new, sweeping bylaw. It would grant the HOA Architectural Review Committee, which she and Mark controlled, the power to mandate necessary aesthetic upgrades to any property deemed to be out of compliance. Homeowners would be forced to pay for expensive renovations, new roofing, updated siding, professional landscaping, all chosen by the committee. Failure to comply would result in crippling fines, followed by a lien on the property, and ultimately foreclosure. It was a weapon of immense power, and she had every intention of aiming it directly at the little gatehouse at the end of her street. She was so consumed by her own brilliance, so convinced of Leo's powerlessness, that she barely registered the official-looking letter that arrived at the HOA's post office box a few days later. It was a formal inquiry from a landowner of record, Evergreen Properties, LLC, requesting copies of all proposed bylaws for review. "Legal nonsense," she had scoffed, tossing it onto a pile of invoices. "Some holding company from the original development. They probably dissolved decades ago." She did not give it a second thought. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The next day, Leo drove his old sedan into the city. The offices of Harrison and Sterling occupied the top 3 floors of a gleaming skyscraper, a world of polished marble, hushed tones, and quiet, immense power. He was led into a corner office with a panoramic view of the city skyline. Mr. Jonathan Harrison rose to greet him. He was an older gentleman with kind eyes and a handshake as firm as oak. "Leo," he said warmly, "it's good to finally meet you. I knew your grandfather for over 40 years. You have his eyes." They sat in plush leather chairs. Mr. Harrison gestured to a thick, leather-bound portfolio on the massive mahogany desk between them. "Your grandfather, Arthur, was a remarkable man," the lawyer began. "He was a visionary, quiet like you, but he saw things others missed." Leo listened, intrigued. "When he purchased the land that is now Oakwood Estates back in the 1950s, it was just a failed dairy farm miles from the city," Harrison continued. "Everyone thought he was crazy, but Arthur saw the path of progress. He knew the city would grow to meet him." The lawyer opened the portfolio. Inside were maps, deeds, and corporate charters, all preserved with meticulous care. Arthur didn't just want to be a developer who built houses, sold them, and walked away. He believed in stewardship. He wanted to create a community but retain control to ensure it was managed properly for the long term. He slid a document across the desk. So he established a holding company, Evergreen Properties, LLC. Through that company, he developed the land, laid the infrastructure, and then offered the lots not for sale, but for 99-year lease. Leo stared at the document. The words swam before his eyes. "The homeowners," Harrison said gently, seeing the confusion on Leo's face. "They own their houses, the physical structures, but the land underneath them, the roads, the common areas, the clubhouse, all of it is, and always has been, owned by Evergreen Properties." A silence fell over the room, broken only by the distant hum of the city. "When your grandfather passed away, he left the company entirely to you, Leo. It was placed in a blind trust managed by this firm with instructions that you were not to be burdened with its administration unless you chose to be, or unless a specific need arose." Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his expression serious. "I believe that need has now arisen." Leo felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He did not just own his small gatehouse, he owned the entire neighborhood. He owned the pristine lawn in front of Claire's mansion. He owned the very ground the HOA clubhouse stood on, the violation notices, the fines, the condescension. It was all the absurd posturing of a tenant trying to evict the owner of the entire building. The irony was so staggering, so immense, that he almost laughed. "The Homeowners Association," Harrison explained, "is technically a tenant organization. Its existence is permitted by the master lease agreement which your grandfather drafted. Their bylaws are subordinate to that agreement in all matters." He pointed to a specific clause. "And this clause here gives the landowner, that is you, the right to review, approve, or veto any new bylaw or capital expenditure. It also gives you the right to dissolve the board and call for new elections if they are found to be acting outside the scope of their authority or against the interests of the community." The full extent of his power settled upon him. It was a power he had never sought, a responsibility he had never known he had. For years he had weathered Claire's storm, believing himself to be a small boat in a vast ocean. Now he realized he was not the boat, he was the ocean. The weariness that had clouded his spirit for 2 years evaporated, replaced by a crystalline clarity. The face of his grandfather flashed in his mind, a man of quiet strength and deep integrity. He knew what he had to do. "Claire is planning to pass a new bylaw," Leo said, his voice steady and firm in a way it had not been for years. "She wants the power to force residents to make expensive changes to their homes." Mr. Harrison nodded slowly. "We are aware. Our letter of inquiry to them has so far been ignored. They are acting with an arrogance that stems from ignorance. It will be their undoing." The click moment happened right there, in that quiet, powerful office high above the city. It was the sound of a patient man finally reaching his limit. It was the sound of a sleeping giant waking up. "What do we do?" Leo asked. A slow smile spread across Mr. Harrison's face. "We let them walk right into the trap they've set for themselves," the lawyer said. "We create a plan." For the next 2 hours, they mapped out their strategy. It would not be a brute force attack. It would be elegant, surgical, and executed using the very rules Claire had created to consolidate her power. The first step was for Leo to formally activate his control over evergreen properties. Mr. Harrison produced a set of documents. Leo signed them without hesitation, his signature firm and decisive. With a few strokes of a pen, decades of dormant power were transferred into his active control. "The plan is simple," Harrison explained, leaning back in his chair. "Claire intends to hold a community-wide meeting to vote on her new tyrannical bylaw. This is her grand moment, the coronation of her power." He steepled his fingers. "We will let her have her moment. We will let her make her speech, whip up her supporters, and call for the vote. We will let her believe she has won." "And then?" Leo asked. "And then," Harrison said, a glint in his eye, "you will stand up. As the sole owner of Oakwood Estates, you will exercise your legal right." The nature of the plan was devastating in its simplicity. They would use Claire's own arrogance as their primary weapon. Her lust for public victory would be the stage for her public humiliation. The first and only move they needed to make before the meeting was a quiet one. Mr. Harrison's office would send a second letter to the HOA board, this time by registered mail, impossible to ignore. It would be a formal notification that a representative of Evergreen Properties LLC would be in attendance at the upcoming meeting to observe the proceedings. It would not name the representative. It would be just enough of a legal tremor to be unsettling, but not enough to make Claire and Mark pause their crusade. Their overconfidence, Harrison reasoned, would lead them to dismiss it as a mere formality. Leo left the law office feeling like a different man. The weight of Claire's oppression was gone, replaced by a cold, hard sense of purpose. He drove home, not in a 10-year-old sedan, but in a vehicle of quiet rebellion. He passed Claire's house, where a team of landscapers was busy installing enormous, ornate topiaries shaped like swans at the community entrance. He knew from the neighborhood chatter that this was another of Claire's pet projects, funded by a hefty special assessment fee she had levied on every homeowner. He watched them work, a faint smile on his lips. They were beautifying his property with his tenants' money at the direction of a woman he was about to depose. The irony was delicious. When he got home, he walked out to his garden. He looked at the violation notice still sitting on his porch table. He picked it up, tore it into 4 neat pieces, and dropped it into his recycling bin. Over the next week, the atmosphere in Oakwood Estates grew thick with anticipation. Flyers for the special bylaw meeting appeared on every lamppost. Claire sent out a flurry of emails, her tone becoming increasingly triumphant. "Let's come together to protect our investment and beautify our community," one read. "It's time to enforce a standard of excellence for everyone." Leo watched it all from a serene distance. He tended his garden, he read his books, and he waited. The registered letter from Harrison and Sterling arrived at the HOA's address. As predicted, Claire saw it as a minor annoyance. "Look at this, Mark," she said, waving the letter dismissively. "This Evergreen Properties is sending a spy. They probably want to make sure we're not planning to build a water park." Mark laughed. "Let them watch. When this bylaw passes, we'll be the most pristine neighborhood in the state. They should be paying us a management fee." They were so blinded by their perceived superiority that they failed to perform the most basic due diligence. A simple search of the county's property records would have revealed everything. But in their minds, Leo was a powerless recluse, and they were the masters of their universe. Why would they bother to check the fine print? The night of the meeting arrived. The community clubhouse was packed. the air buzzing with a mixture of excitement from Claire's supporters and anxiety from those who feared her new powers. Claire and Mark sat at the head table on a raised platform, looking down at the assembled homeowners. Claire was dressed in a sharp, white power suit, a stark contrast to the soft, earthy tones Leo wore. Leo slipped into the room and took a seat in the back row next to Mr. Harrison, who looked like any other distinguished, retired resident. No one paid them any mind. All eyes were on the stage. Claire tapped the microphone, a sharp sound that cut through the chatter. The room fell silent. "Welcome, neighbours," she began, her voice smooth and confident. "Thank you for coming tonight. We are at a pivotal moment for Oakwood Estates, a moment where we must choose between mediocrity and excellence." She launched into a soaring, dramatic speech about property values, curb appeal, and community standards. She painted a picture of a perfect, harmonious neighborhood where every lawn was immaculate, every house a shining example of affluence. She spoke of the few exceptions that threatened this vision, the pockets of neglect that could spread like a disease. Though she never used his name, every word was a poisoned dart aimed directly at Leo in the back of the room. He sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable, letting the venom wash over him. He felt the stares of his neighbours, some pitying, some scornful. He endured it one last time. "This new bylaw," Claire announced, her voice reaching a crescendo, "will give your elected board the tools we need to protect our shared dream. It will ensure that Oakwood Estates remains the premier community it was always meant to be." She finished to a round of enthusiastic applause, led by Mark. "I am now calling for a vote on Bylaw 11.2, the Aesthetic Harmony Mandate," she declared. "All in favour, please say aye." A chorus of ayes filled the room. "All opposed?" A few hesitant nays were quickly drowned out. A triumphant, cruel smile spread across Claire's face. She looked out over the crowd, her gaze sweeping past the back row, not even registering his presence. "The motion passes," she said, her voice ringing with victory. "The bylaw is effective immediately. The Architectural Review Committee will begin issuing notices next week." She was about to bang her gavel when a calm voice rose from the back of the room. "Point of order, Madam President." Every head turned. Leo stood up, slowly. The room fell into a stunned silence. Claire's smile faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. "You are out of order, Leo," she snapped. "The vote is concluded." "I'm afraid it is not," Leo said, his voice quiet but carrying an undeniable authority that startled everyone, most of all Claire. "Because you did not have the legal authority to call the vote in the first place." A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. Mark stood up, his face reddening. "Who do you think you are? Sit down before I have you removed." "I don't think you want to do that," Leo replied calmly. He began to walk down the central aisle toward the stage. Mr. Harrison stood and followed a few paces behind him. "You have spent the last 2 years treating me like I don't belong here," Leo said, his voice growing stronger with each step. "You've tried to fine me and legislate me out of my own home." He stopped at the foot of the stage, looking directly up at Claire, whose face was now a mask of confusion and rage. "But what you didn't know, Claire, is that this isn't just my home." He paused, letting the words hang in the dead silent room. "It's my property, all of it." He gestured to Mr. Harrison. "Allow me to introduce my legal counsel, Jonathan Harrison of Harrison and Sterling. He represents the interests of the landowner, Evergreen Properties, LLC. And I," Leo said, his voice ringing with finality, "am Evergreen Properties." The collective gasp in the room was audible. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, holding a copy of the master lease agreement. "As my client has stated, the lawyer announced in a clear, formal tone. He is the sole owner of the entity that owns every parcel of land within Oakwood Estates. This organization, the HOA, exists only at his discretion and is subject to the terms of the master agreement signed by every original leaseholder. Claire's face had gone from red to a deathly pale. That's impossible," she stammered. "You're lying. He's a nobody." "I assure you, the county records are quite clear," Mr. Harrison said smoothly, "and according to Article 12, Section 4 of that agreement, the landowner retains ultimate veto power over any and all bylaw changes. Therefore, on behalf of my client, I must inform you that the vote you just held is null and void. Bylaw 11.2 is vetoed." The finality of the lawyer's words struck the room like a thunderclap. Claire stared at Leo, her mind reeling, unable to process the cataclysmic reversal of fortune. The man she had mocked, the man she had tried to drive out, the man she considered a failure, owned everything. Her power, her status, her very home. It was all subject to his will. The foundation of her world had just turned to dust. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, you can't!" Then the denial shattered, and pure, undiluted rage took its place. "You did this to ruin me," she shrieked, her voice shrill and ugly. "You pathetic little man! You sat there in your filthy little garden, plotting this all along." Her public mask of cool sophistication was gone, replaced by the raw, desperate fury of a dethroned tyrant. The neighbors watched, their expressions shifting from confusion to shock, and then to dawning comprehension. They were seeing the real Claire for the first time. Mark tried to intervene, stepping toward the microphone. "Now let's all be reasonable." "Reasonable?" Leo interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Was it reasonable to send me violation notices for wildflowers? Was it reasonable to try and force me out of my grandfather's home with punitive fines and public humiliation?" He turned his attention back to Claire, his eyes cold. "I did not seek this power, Claire. It was given to me, but you forced me to use it." He then delivered the final act. "As the representative of Evergreen Properties," Leo announced, his voice now commanding the entire room, "I am invoking Article 15 of the Master Agreement, which allows the landowner to act in the case of gross mismanagement by the Tenant Association Board." He looked at Claire, Mark, and their cronies at the head table. "The current HOA board is hereby dissolved, effective immediately." Another wave of gasps went through the crowd. "Furthermore," Leo continued, his voice relentless, "I am calling for an immediate and full, independent audit of the HOA's finances, paying special attention to the recent special assessment used to fund the new landscaping at the community entrance." At the mention of the audit, Mark's face went ashen. He and Claire exchanged a look of pure panic. Leo knew, in that instant, that they had not just been arrogant, they had been corrupt. He had said all he needed to say. He turned his back on the stage, on Claire's sputtering rage and Mark's terrified silence, and walked calmly out of the clubhouse, Mr. Harrison by his side. He left behind the wreckage of a petty kingdom and a community of neighbors who were finally seeing the truth. The aftermath was swift and devastating for Claire and Mark. The audit, conducted by a forensic accounting firm hired by Harrison, uncovered a systematic pattern of embezzlement. They had been overbilling for community projects like the topiaries and pocketing the difference. Faced with irrefutable proof, several of the neighbors filed a class action lawsuit. Claire and Mark were ruined, not just socially but financially. The final, quietest blow came from Leo. When the 99-year lease on Claire's property came up for its periodic review a few months later, his company, Evergreen Properties, simply chose not to renew it. She was given a legal, formal notice to vacate the property within 60 days. She was evicted from the very house she had stolen from him, a house that sat on land he owned. Mark, seeing their shared future was one of court dates and bankruptcy, abandoned her almost immediately. Claire lost everything: the house, the money, the status she had worshipped. The last Leo heard, she was living in a small apartment across town, a ghost of the suburban queen she had once been. Leo, in his victory, was the picture of grace. He did not lord his power over his neighbors. Instead, he worked with them to establish a new, simpler, and more democratic community board. The oppressive rulebook of bylaws was trimmed down to a few common-sense guidelines. The fines and violation notices stopped. Using funds from the LLC, he had the gaudy topiaries removed. In their place, he commissioned the creation of a beautiful community park filled with the same kinds of native wildflowers that grew in his own garden. It became a place where children played and neighbors gathered, a true community hub. He remained in his small, humble gatehouse, finding contentment not in his immense wealth, but in the peace he had restored. One afternoon, as he was tending to the new park, a woman approached him. It was Sarah, a quiet artist who lived a few streets over. She had always been one of the few people who had smiled at him during the dark times. "I never told you," she said softly, "but I always loved your garden. It was the most honest thing in this whole neighborhood." Leo smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you," he said. "Honesty is all I ever wanted." They started talking and they did not stop. They discovered a shared love for quiet things, for nature, for a life lived with integrity rather than for show. A new, healthy and happy chapter of his life began. Months later, Leo and Sarah sat on a bench in the park he had built, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. He was at peace, his quiet strength no longer hidden, but integrated into a life of purpose. He had not become a tyrant in his victory, but a steward just as his grandfather had intended. True power, he had learned, was not in what a person controlled or how loudly they spoke. It lay in the quiet resilience of the spirit, in the integrity of one's character, and in the courage to protect the things that truly matter. True wealth was not measured in the size of a house or the balance of a bank account, but in the richness of a peaceful heart and a thriving, genuine community.